So I've been running ultramarathons for over a decade now. I've completed, out of 6 attempts, 4 100-mile races, probably over a dozen 50-mile, 50K runs. I've lost track of how many marathons. In a more ambitious moment, I even ran a 50K solo and unsupported on the Great Wall of China. Now, despite the slide behind me, I've never actually run 1,000 consecutive miles. But despite the poetry of that, I also thought it carried a certain relevance, because when I was looking back over my training runs, I saw that over this past decade plus, in order for me to stand at the start line of a 100-mile ultramarathon with at least a reasonable chance of completing that run within the 30-hour time limit, I need to put in about 1,000 miles of training in the 10 months preceding that race. And I think that races themselves get a little bit too much glory. If this was a movie, it would be the race, it would be the finish line where the hero or the heroine would cross it and they would do the slow motion and they would play some fanfare of music. And the weeks, the months, the years of training would get compressed down into a montage of video clips or images that did not, to me, appropriately recognize the hard work or what it actually takes to show up at the start line, much less make it across the finish line. So what I want to talk about today is I want to unpack that montage. I don't want to talk about the race. I want to talk about those weeks, those months, those years of training. Now, when I began running races, or continued running races, what I didn't expect is that I would have to take what I'd learned in training for ultramarathons, and I would have to apply it to my life over weeks, over months, over, in fact, the past 3 years. And I'm going to stick with this running metaphor, and if I stick with this running metaphor, then we need some sort of start, right, for there to be a finish line. So if there's a start to this race, that was October 16th, 2013. Which was approximately 1 month after this photo was taken. In this photo, I was preparing to cross the finish line of the Hallucination 100-mile ultramarathon in southeast Michigan with the support of my wife. But October 16th was not a day where there was a race. It was, in fact, perhaps to be cliche, a normal day. I was at work at the university teaching. My wife, Holly, was at home with our 2-year-old son, Oliver. Our 7-year-old son was at school in 2nd grade. I remember it was 4:20. I was leaving my statistics course, and in a bit of a rush to get home because I knew our older son, Elliot, had to get ready for karate class. I remember pulling in the driveway and thinking I hoped that Holly had him in his karate uniform so that things would be less rushed in order to make it to class on time. When I walked through the door, Elliot called up from the basement that he could not wake up his mother. I went down quickly. When I touched her knee, I knew that something was seriously wrong, called 911, and began chest compressions. I asked Elliot to take Oliver upstairs, but Oliver was 2, and he still is strong-willed. So they sat on the basement floor quietly watching while I did chest compressions and counted off with the 911 operator. I remember the police arriving a short time later. And a few months later, we found out that she had passed away from essentially an undiagnosed heart condition, and that she had passed quietly, quickly, perhaps like falling asleep. Now, needless to say, you don't go through something like that and walk out the other side the same person, although I confess to you that I had a bit of an expectation that I would go through some sort of grieving process, and I, in fact, would be able to walk through to the other side and form some sort of normal. Because I thought the grieving process, perhaps like a race, would have some finish line at the end that I could cross if I simply worked hard enough and challenged myself to put in the appropriate number of miles. The problem was, it wasn't like that. It was a whole lot more like this, with ups and downs, 2 steps forward followed by 3 steps back. memories that came with sights and sounds and smells within a house that was filled with memories. And even worse, years later, when perhaps the memories did not come as quickly as they had before. But I was ambitious, and I thought, hey, if other people have traversed this journey, this 1,000 miles, if you will, metaphorically, of grief, it's something that I could do as well. And I decided that I needed a framework to imagine the unimaginable. And so I turned to that which I was doing regularly anyway. I thought I would turn to the rules that I had used in my ultramarathon training. And so these are the 4 things that I took from my running, and I did my utmost to try to get through those weeks, those months, those now going on 3 years. So the first rule in ultra running, as I applied it, was keep moving forward. If you're running long distances, this makes sense. If you can't run, you walk. If you can't walk, you crawl. I've never actually crawled during a race, but I have shuffled forward with such pathetic speed, it would have been faster if I had crawled. And I have distinct memories of my first 100-mile race, standing by a campfire at an aid station in the woods of Ontario, Canada, with the temperature dropping, I kid you not, wolves howling in the distance, friendly aid station workers, and a chair that I could have sat in and curled up under a blanket and spent the entire night there. The problem was the finish line was still 25 miles in the other direction. So there was a seduction in staying still. And similarly, there's a seduction in some of the memories that I would have liked to hold on to indefinitely, because those memories have her still alive. The problem, of course, if you have a 2-year-old and you have a 7-year-old, the 2-year-old needs to be potty trained, give up his pacifier. He needs to, most recently, get ready to go to kindergarten. My 7-year-old, of course, had soccer and Cub Scouts and all of the other million things that are part of being a child. And regardless of my desire that they remain in the pajamas that were sewn by their mother, they outgrew them. So I moved forward as best I could. But I needed some rules in moving forward, because there is also a danger in moving forward too quickly. And so I applied the second rule, which is the 10% rule. And for those of you who don't run, that is the idea that you should not increase your training mileage by more than 10% in any given week, so that you do not put your body under stress that it is not able to hold up under, and then you become injured and undermine your entire training plan. And so I did my utmost to move forward incrementally, took her clothes out of the closet a little bit at a time before finally moving them into a storage unit, because I did not want to throw them away all at once. And the truth is, it didn't always work very well. There were times I took on too much, and I found myself laying in bed staring at the ceiling for hours under the emotional weight, or yelling at my children for things that were not their fault. I'm not necessarily proud of that. But I did move forward, and I moved forward with help, and that was the third rule. The third rule, if you're training for an ultramarathon, is you need people to help you. If you're going to run for 12 hours just on a training run, you need someone to watch your kids. If you're going to run for 28, 29, or 30 hours, you need somebody who's going to help you change your shoes as they swell up over the first 50 hours. You need somebody to remind you to eat, to drink. You have to think about headlamps, the batteries for those headlamps. You have to think about changing weather conditions, changing clothes appropriately. Nutritional needs, how many calories can you take in versus how many 600 or 700 calories you're burning per hour. And you need somebody to assist you as you engage in what I like to think of as cognitive decline, which is the nice way of saying you get stupid the farther you run, and to remind you to eat or to drink, or just tell you that you look fine even though you know that you do not. I had a great support system. I'm very grateful to my parents who supported me in every way that they could, from watching the children to help me renovate the basement. Holly's parents, in a generous act, sold both their houses and moved nearby, because raising children without their mother is not something that concludes after 1 week or 2 weeks, a year, or even 3. The truth is, I'm not great at asking for help. I'm kind of one of those independent personalities that had to think about where and when and how to ask for help. And actually, in order to do that, I had to do the fourth thing, which was learn to pay attention to pain, which I realize sounds a little bit masochistic when I say it out loud. But then again, you realize if you're training for an ultramarathon, if you're going through months of intense training, there are times that things hurt. And in fact, there are times that things hurt where it is, if you will, a good sort of pain, because your muscles are breaking down and they're preparing to rebuild themselves stronger with more endurance. That's the point. But if things are going poorly and you've got the pain that is associated with ill-fitting shoes or overtraining, or your joints are starting to break down, and you do not address that problem, you can again undermine this training plan that is going to take you to the start and ideally to the finish line that you are preparing for. So I find it similar with grief, that there is a good sort of pain that is inevitable because there is a love that is lost. But I think there is similarly a bad sort of pain where bad decisions are made, or a dark cloud can hover over you that you cannot remove without the assistance of friends or family or a support group or therapy. And the real challenge, of course, is distinguishing between those two types of pain, because if it was obvious, you would simply learn to embrace the former and work to prevent the latter. Now, if you're really paying attention, my running metaphor is starting to break down because there is no race and there is no finish line. But that's okay, because this metaphor was never really meant for you. The metaphor was for me because I find it extraordinarily difficult to talk about the loss of my wife. It is much easier to talk about running. But I've asked myself at times how it is that I go on despite the tragedy that occurred on October 16th. And then I remind myself that I go on because of what took place the 16 years prior. And the lessons that I've offered had to do with ultra running. These things like perseverance, planning, kindness and caring for others, and even just being self-aware. These are characteristics that describe my wife. And so, there is no finish line, I've told you already. But I remind myself that I do not need to be defined by what took place on October 16th. That instead I can be defined by what took place the 16 years that we shared together. And even if there is no finish line, I think that it is still important to celebrate milestones. And I'm very proud and pleased to tell you that I was able to celebrate one of those milestones a few weeks ago when I again crossed the finish line of the Hallucination 100-mile trail ultramarathon, this time in honor of my wife. Thank you.